Today I'm going to talk about my second study, which is called, currently, The Value of Words, Using Narrative Comments from a Summative OSCE to Distinguish Between Good and Poor Performers. It's in line with my research program dealing with assessment and communication, and I'll give you a brief background of myself and kind of how I got to this point as well. And currently with this study, I've got my results, and I'm really interested in your feedback and thoughts on interpretation and what you think of the results and how you feel that they may be useful for contributing to the overall research field in assessment. I'd like to acknowledge Diana Dolmans and Marianne Gobert and Susan Austin as my supervisors and my collaborators with this project. So if I can figure out, here we go. So I think I was talking with Keys this past week, and he kept being curious as to why my time difference was only an hour, because I am Canadian, but I do live in Qatar. So I was born in Canada, in a place called Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, and it was there where I became a pharmacist. And then after spending some time in West Africa, I moved back to Vancouver, where I did my postgraduate doctorate clinical degree. And in 2012, I relocated to Doha as an assistant professor at Qatar University. And I've been working there since, and now I'm working in the capacity as an associate professor and the assessment coordinator. And thought I would like to self-better, increase my skills in educational research. And so in 2012, I applied, or 2014, I applied to a master's and started my PhD in November of 2014. And the reason why I applied originally was because I had come from Canada and I'd had some differing international experience. But what I really found when I was designing OSCEs and assessments here was I thought that there may be some questions with how culture may play a role with assessment, especially communication skills. Specifically looking at the kneecap as the veil that the students wear. We have all female students in our college, and about half of them are the kneecap. And so although my research project has nothing to do with that, it's what sparked my initial interest in assessment communication and how a Western trained versus a non-Western trained assessor may interpret different components of communication. So where I'm at, I keep pressing down, where I'm at with my PhD now is I finished my first study and it was published this year. And what we did there is we looked at cultural dimensions theory, and we determined whether or not it could explain variations in quantitative assessment of communication in patient-practitioner interactions, as well as what assessors focused on in terms of instrumental versus effective communication. And our findings were interesting. We found that the theory could explain variation, because we did find variation within our quantitative and our qualitative approach. And what our major bottom line was that we really think that these different interpretations are valid. Standardization may not be our goal, especially in diverse cultural settings. And so we sought to try to explore a new assessment method that could capture these varying interpretations of performance. There's been a lot of work done in workplace-based assessments with narratives, and how narratives can not only capture comments, but also be used in an evaluation purpose, where we do see from Ginsberg's work relatively good reliability and credibility as a narrative, as an evaluation tool. And so we decided to use that, but within the OSCE context, which is primarily with the assessment methods which I develop here in Qatar. So that led to study number 2. And as I said, we collected our data and analyzed, and we're just discussing the results and interpreting. And what the study really wanted to find was, okay, if we use a narrative assessment method, how can we really distinguish between good and poor performers? For instance, Ginsberg found in workplace-based assessment that assessors are quite reliable, and they can overall, using holistic assessments from clinical internships, make a good judgment about good and poor performers. But what about in OSCE context where it's more of a micro scale, and each station represents a totally different context, where a performer may perform good in one station, and the same person may perform poor in another station. So this is my visual interpretation. Since I was in Maastricht at Sheet Academy, I tried to increase my creative abilities in presentation and poster creation. But really what the problem statement was for this is, if we get in narrative evaluation, how can we look at that, analyze it, and determine whether or not it was a good or poor performer to eventually make a pass-fail decision, which is coming up in a different study, but at least giving a sense of what data the narrative can include or does include. I think this slide is a little bit out of place, but I wanted to introduce it here. One of the lenses that we looked at was politeness theory, and you may be familiar from Ginsberg's work using politeness theory in workplace-based assessment and narrative comments, that when assessors write assessments or evaluations of students, specifically in the clinical internship context, they tend to disguise their comments using politeness theory, so different strategies in order to save the face of the student or the assessor, or basically lessen the impact, negative impacts on the student overall and the assessor team. And so I just wanted to introduce these concepts, and then we'll talk about them a bit more when we get to my results. But basically, if a comment is written very direct and clear without any disguising or hidden code that someone would need to decipher, we would call that bald on record. There's things called in-group identification, where it would say, okay, you are, the student exemplifies a great pharmacist or a great doctor. So putting them into that professional entity. Compliments, pretty straightforward. Hedging is what Ginsberg found was primarily the strategy that was primarily used in her work. And hedging is using a word or phrase or some sort of adapter to modify the way something fits into a set. So for example, instead of someone saying she was loud, they could say she was slightly loud. So they're not quite in that loud category, but they're modifying the way that they're trying to tell you that she was indeed that loud. Or the person could have had more eye contact rather than they should have had more eye contact. So not quite taking them out of that good eye contact category yet. Minimization of imposition, simply to minimize the impact of imposition or impact that it would have on the listener. Conventional indirectness, that's quite common in medical education. We know that if someone says, oh, she was good, or he had good written abilities, they might not actually mean that it was good. They might actually mean that it was just okay or suboptimal, whereas words like great or excellent are ones that we tend to see more reflective of a good performer. And depersonalization, so taking out the Kyle was a great performer or she was a great performer and simply using a third person approach. So keep this in mind as we go through. The research questions that I developed for this study were broad, but then we sub-specified. So basically, we really just wanted to know how assessors use narrative to differentiate between good and poor performance, specifically regarding trainee communication skills during an OSCE. And then we wanted to look at that through two different lenses. The first one was content, so what constructs are used by assessors to differentiate, and then linguistics, so how do assessors use linguistics, and specifically, again, that politeness theory to differentiate between good and poor performers. This is a very simplified version of our methods. We ran a summative OSCE for graduating pharmacy students in Qatar last year, so about a year ago. And we have a small population in Qatar, which is, of course, always a limitation here, but we had 14 students consented, 9 interactive stations where it was a patient-practitioner interaction, and 18 assessors. So we had 2 assessors recruited per station who were instructed to write narrative evaluations and also rank the student on a 5-point Likert scale for global performance. Now, just keep in mind for any ethical considerations that this all occurred over and above the regular assessment methods for the OSCE. So this was in addition and did not actually influence the students' marks for this particular exam, because this was a real, actual exam. We then compiled all the narratives data together and then looked at each assessor pair per station and extracted the top 2 and bottom 2 narratives, students, I guess the top 2 bottom 2 students, the narratives for those students per station in order to see how we can differentiate and how differentiation occurred between the top and the bottom. So keep in mind again that one student could have been a bottom performer on 3 stations, but a top performer on another station. And so we looked at it from specifically the station level. We then performed two qualitative approaches. One was the content analysis, looking for constructs using an open coding kind of bottom-up approach. And the second was a linguistic analysis where we applied politeness theory from Brown and Levinson to our narratives to determine what strategies, if any, did assessors use when communicating their comments. This is an example of a narrative that we obtained. Assessors did receive about a small training session from myself, where we didn't instruct them in very detailed approach. We wanted them, and we were specifically wanting to be a bit more, for them to be a bit more open-ended in their narrative writing. This was because we were also trying to figure out if narratives can capture different perspectives. And so you see there that the student number and then handwritten comments regarding the narrative evaluations that they observed. And then at the bottom there, we had a 5-point Likert scale, which is what we use in our program as a whole to evaluate students from a global perspective. And just as a note, all assessors did have experience evaluating students within an OSCE or workplace-based setting, and specifically about communication skills. Our results, we did have all 14 students consent. 9 stations, 18 assessors resulted in 252 narrative evaluations. After extraction of the top 2 and bottom 2 per station, we were left with 36 good performer narratives and 36 poor performer narratives. So after analyzing, I'll briefly display the results for the 2 research questions. But again, we looked at the different constructs that were used by assessors to differentiate between good and poor performance. So as you can see, we've identified 4 major constructs: confidence, adaptability, patient safety, and professionalism. So what's really interesting about these results is that it was major overarching concepts rather than specific behaviors that people were using to differentiate. For instance, when I first set out to do this, I thought, okay, well, if it's going to be poor eye contact, poor gestures, it's going to be those micro behaviors that were going to be the ones that were going to influence the decision making. But what I found when I did this analysis was that across good and poor performers, some good performers had poor eye contact or poor gestures, and that was documented, but they still received a 5. Whereas it was things like, again, confidence, adaptability, threats to patient safety, and professionalism, where if an assessor wrote about that in a positive or negative way, that was a pattern with then the student being given a higher or low score, a corresponding higher or low score. Confidence, again, is something that's somewhat hard to define, but these definitions came from the narratives themselves. So we thought that confidence really represented verbal and nonverbal communication strategies to demonstrate command of the interaction and effectively convey information. So an example would be the student had a strong voice tone which demonstrated confidence. So they were using those micro behaviors in order to justify these larger, more constructs. Adaptability. So Marianne and I had a conversation whether this should be called patient-centered care, because that really did come out within the narratives, is when the student was patient-centered in their communication. They received very high grades and vice versa for low grades. But really it was also rapport, so developing a positive relationship with the patient and responding appropriately by tailoring communication. Patient safety was interesting. It wasn't something we expected to come out, especially regarding communication skills. So many times, if a student had poor communication skills, the assessors would note that rushed the interaction, and this would threaten patient safety, for instance. And so those ones were actually quite frequent and were quite associated with the quantitative rankings of being good or poor performer. And finally, professionalism. So aside from your usual friendly, respectful mannerisms or demeanor, the thing here to think about is when an assessor could look at a student or watch a student and think, okay, this student represents part of my profession. And specifically regarding professional dress or hairstyle, which was interesting, as almost all of our students wore the hijab. Those were the things that the assessors were focusing on. And then when they weren't, deemed them not to be part of the profession, whereas did not use professional judgment in a certain way, came out a few times, then that was associated with a lower ranking overall. So I've given a bit of this slide already in my description, but just as a bit of a summary for these constructs. So really, how did they use to differentiate? Well, we found overall that for all the constructs, most of the constructs, that for poor performers, they were given specific behaviors that try to justify their judgment. So for instance, not confident uses words such as like something and not sure of self. And the amount of comments that I had in quotations on the narratives was quite interesting, and it was always usually used to justify poor performance. Whereas a good performer was more holistic of, oh, they were confident in their approach, rather than actually specifying certain words or behaviors. Rewarded patient-centeredness for good performers. So anytime they, of course, tailor the communication, expresses compassion, responds perceptively to patient feelings, those were rewarded, and then vice versa, those were punished. Punished when patient safety was at risk, so referred to another pharmacist dangerous. Again, not unexpectedly, those were associated with poor performers. And then again, as I identified, those professional identifiers influence the performance perception. So really needs to work on professional appearance or explains professional responsibility to be a standardized patient. And these were the ways that assessors typically use those constructs to differentiate between both good and poor performance. Now switching gears, the second part of the analysis was the politeness strategy. So how do assessors use linguistics or politeness to differentiate between good and poor performance? Very, very interesting. We basically found no politeness was coded in about 75% of comments, 70% of poor performers, and 77% of good performers. And I'll explain why I feel it's interesting after. Depersonalization occurred as well very commonly, and then on a kind of like a post hoc second glance, we really don't think depersonalization was relevant to our specific context as a politeness strategy, simply because they're observing behaviors in a 7-minute interaction, and it's not like they have had, they're communicating that behavior directly to the student face to face. And so it would make sense that comments were depersonalized and that wouldn't actually reflect a form of politeness. Hedging, so hedging, such as with the Ginsberg studies, was our most common politeness strategy that we identified, and it was more common in poor performers. So again, hedging is how using different words or phrases to adapt how, or modify how something fits within a set. We almost entirely found that they used adapters alone. So there's 3 different types of hedges that we are aware of or relate to this. So plausibility shields, attribution shields, and then adapters. And adapters are the things like they were a little bit scared or they were slightly exaggerated. It was those types of comments that we were coding for this. Very rarely did we have things such as, I think the student should do this. It was more of the adapters. And that was statistically significant. Again, keeping in mind that in the good performers, there could have been negative comments that were hedged, but overall, more negative comments and more hedging occurred in poor performers. Minimization occurred at about a 5% rate, so not a great amount there. Another very interesting finding from this is that assessors did not use things like compliments or in-group identity markers, which was found to be more common in workplace-based assessments. And so we thought maybe they would use those to distinguish a good performer specifically versus a poor performer, but we weren't coding that at all. And just as a kind of an example, again, she was a bit rude, could be more assertive instead of should be more assertive. She was slightly loud in her approach. An example of minimization, in case you're interested, I like this one, needs to make more eye contact when writing, otherwise has good eye contact. So how do you interpret that? What sort of deciphering goes on there? Does that mean that the student had good eye contact, or is that them trying to say they had poor eye contact, but they're trying to minimize the impact that would have on the student themselves? So looking at those 2 lenses, we have tried to distinguish our major findings from this. The first major finding, I would say, is that this narrative feedback in an OSCE is specific and direct. So what I mean by that is kind of that 3rd bullet point there. If we're looking at narrative comments on a narrative evaluation, we generally can say, okay, if they say she had poor eye contact, but we can say that she had poor eye contact. We don't need to go further and decipher much or look for hidden codes for which we know that we need to do in workplace-based assessment. So in order to distinguish them between good and poor performers, we can take the narrative comments generally at face value. And I think that's useful for summative decision making. So if narrative is to become an assessment method, and then we have expert assessors assess a narrative profile from all stations. Overall, I think hopefully that would lead to more reliable and credible decision making, as well as the potential to enhance student learning. So students like clear and direct feedback, for which they don't have to decipher much. And so we don't know this yet. It could be a future study, but how students would react to this and how it could actually impact their learning and future behavior. The second finding, again, related to constructs. So we found the overarching constructs were used to differentiate rather than specific behaviors. And again, this was a bit surprising to me, just because when we assess communication, typically, you can use rubrics, checklists, many different ways, but really focus on the behaviors. And it's not necessarily a bad strategy, but it seems that when assessors were given the chance to explain their judgments through narrative, that it was really those overarching concepts that they focused on, rather than a sum of all of the micro behaviors as a whole. So just to go back to my research questions, I talked about this at length, but we did identify some constructs that were used by assessors to differentiate between good and poor performance. And then, although politeness strategies were rarely used, there was some hedging, and that there could be some deciphering needed for when we're trying to distinguish between them. So I'm very interested in what you have to say. I'm happy to have a discussion, answer any questions. One particular point before I turn it over is specifically why these results would differ so much from workplace-based assessment. And if you're not familiar, basically they found in workplace-based assessment that a large majority of the comments did have politeness associated with them. They didn't really look at it from a content perspective in the way we did. But we have our own hypotheses about that regarding the fact that an OSCE was simply a direct observation. It's task-focused. There's no relationship established with the student and the assessor. And so maybe the assessor isn't actually giving feedback to the students face-to-face. And so maybe that's a major reason why in this context, the comments are not disguised, such as in workplace-based assessment. But I think I will turn it over. I'm not sure if I need to press anything or not, but feel free to take over the mic, and hopefully we'll get some